And we are live. Welcome. It is good to be back on the air again for the Blue Eyed Devil podcast, streaming on Spotify, Amazon, Google Podcasts, and 403LC. I've been doing this for a couple years now. I think I've interviewed almost a dozen guests, and I don't know if I've been as excited as I am for our guest today. I am humbled to welcome my friend, former member of provincial parliament. I can say that because I actually lived in her constituency at one point. The 25th Premier of Ontario. Welcome, Kathleen Wynne.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is so
lovely
nice
to see you.
It's so nice to have you here. And we've known each other for quite a number of years, and with me wearing different hats.
Indeed. And you've got a lot more hair now than you used to have.
You know, that is true, isn't it?
So do I.
Yes, I lived in your constituency for part of my 20s and early 30s. I remember voting in an election where I brought my baby boy with me and cast a ballot that actually had your name on it, which is different than most Ontarians.
Yeah.
But I also knew you when I was a priest, and I had the great privilege and pleasure of caring for and visiting your mother-in-law before she died.
You did. You were very kind to her, and the family was always impressed with your compassion. And I really felt that you served the family so well, and that you were. I'm going to use the word authentic, that you were authentic in that role. And I know we go through changes in our lives, but you always impressed me as someone who was trying so hard to get it right and to connect with people in the best way possible. So I was thrilled then when I read your book and reconnected with you after you left that gig, and now you're in a whole new gig. But it's you are living in. You're living an examined life, and I think that is commendable. So
my very good friend and mentor, Bill Cliff, likes to quote back to me. He's a Bishop of Ontario. He says, "There's a thing about Giffen. The unexamined life is not a life worth living."
Well, you're not going down that path. So
well, and I have to say, I appreciate your. I'm humbled by what you had to say about my authenticity in ministry, and there's certainly what I learned in ministry and how I was formed, and the kinds of connections I made, and the value of brokenness, the value of meeting people where they are. Mm-hmm. The work I do now as a coach, as a podcaster, as a speaker, all of that comes out of those 10 years of experiences. It really does. And I think about your mother-in-law and some other people of her generation, getting to walk alongside people as they approach death, whether they are comfortable with that idea or not. Mm-hmm. You learn so much about humanity as a young man, and I couldn't be more grateful for people like her and what they taught me, frankly.
Well, I mean, it must have been an amazing journey, and for somebody like you who was paying close attention. You were not going through the motions. No. I've been a member of, and I was not an Anglican. I'm not an Anglican. United Church. And my mother-in-law, that same mother-in-law you sat beside, she basically thought the United Church just made it up as it went along.
She told me. I remember her telling me that.
Wasn't a real church. Never mind. We had our differences. But, I've known lots of ministers and priests in the Anglican Church because Jane, my partner, grew up as an Anglican. And like in any profession, there are people who do it with all their heart, and there are people who go through the motions and are doing it on a different level. And so for you, as I watched you, how you were trying to get underneath the ritual and trying to figure out how people worked. And so it doesn't surprise me that the work you're doing now was informed by that.
Yeah. People ask me now sometimes, are you still a priest? And there's that theological answer that I want to come to, which is, once that happens, it's always there, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's like you don't get baptism undone either. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It kind of just is what it is. Do I function in that role today? Probably not. There are so many opportunities, though, that I have to extend priestly ministry, though, where I get down in the hole with people, or in the trench, or I do my work in my own business, which I described around coaching and speaking that. But I also spent some time working in rapid access addiction medicine with CMHA Peel, and then with the Toronto Community Crisis Service. And I actually do some work as a case manager for folks now who are kind of on the verge of homelessness and struggling with mental health and addiction issues. So I get to have my hand in lots of different places. And I actually think, if I'm really honest, I might be more of a priest now than I used to be.
Well, I mean, there's a long conversation to be had about organized religion.
Yeah, there is. I really
and
do. Yeah.
Whatever sect or faith or I don't know, group you belong to, if we believe that there's a fundamental drive to care for each other.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it always happens inside the four walls of a church or a synagogue or a mosque,
Fair.
And so I think it's perfectly legitimate for us to look for that kind of caring in all sorts of places. And the brokenness often doesn't step over the threshold of those buildings, and that's a huge problem. I mean, coming from a Christian background, so I have marveled sometimes at the degree to which people in churches, the things that they do seem to bear no resemblance to what Jesus would have been interested in, So
I do know. Yeah,
yes.
Very much so. It's Holy Week this week. We're heading to Easter on Sunday. There was a time in my life where Holy Week would have meant me leading 18 to 21 services during a week. And my entire focus was what was affectionately called as liturgy, was, building worship for people to come in those four walls, have an experience, and then go out. And it's not that that was a waste of time. I was formed and learned and served in lots of great ways like that. Working in frontline healthcare and in crisis, and especially in rapid access addiction medicine, I found myself surrounded by people who looked a lot different than me and had very different backgrounds than me, which was different than the churches I served. Right, in the Anglican Church, it was a lot of white, historically British people. Right, I've learned so much about faith and about religious example and about service from folks who come from outside of my tradition. I served in almost all those jobs. Served underneath hijab-wearing women who 5 times a day will separate themselves from the group to face east and realign themselves with God. And then would go through periods of their festivals where they would fast. And I could see how difficult it was. And when I asked them about it, they would tell me things like, it's not just the fast, it's the money that's saved from the fasting has to be given to feed someone who can't. I spent a lot of time in church, and churches do great work. I've ran homeless shelters, but there is something to be learned from faiths in other parts of the world, and even right in our multicultural city here in Toronto, about where we may be coming short.
One of my early experiences as a kid growing up in Richmond Hill was of a rupture in a church. So I belonged to Richmond Hill United Church with my family. And we had a young new minister came up from the city of Toronto. Harry Mackay was his name, and he was in his 20s, and he was, by Richmond Hill standards in 1960 or 65, radical.
Sure.
He didn't want to wear robes, and he walked down into the congregation, and he started a youth group. And the congregation literally lost it. They just couldn't handle the what they saw as controversial break from tradition. And my parents left the church as a result of that, and they started what they called a house church. So for 5 years, every Friday, this group of people would gather, and Harry was part of that. I stayed in the church because that was my form of rebellion with my parents. They're leaving.
That, eh?
They're the hippies.
What a rebel. Kathleen Wynne, the rebel who stayed in church.
Yeah, but it was a really interesting experience for me to go through, to watch my parents trying to live out their truth and me trying to say to them, well, this is someplace that I feel like I belong, and you know what, guys, I can be separate from you, so that's a good thing. So it really wasn't about, it wasn't about the dogma, it wasn't about the liturgy, it was about the community and where do we fit and how do we make difference. And I just think that we get way too comfortable in our patterns, and I think that that's to a large extent why churches like the United Church. Now there are faith groups obviously that are growing.
Yeah, for sure.
The United Church of Canada is not one of them, and I think they're good questions about what needs to happen. And some of the Anglican churches that you're describing are not growing either.
The churches that are growing are ones that are diverse. That's just the truth,
exactly.
right? Whether that's because of, Catholic churches that are filled with immigrants from around the world, or whether it's churches that have really honed in on a cultural group that historically is tied to them. But the ones, like if you go to a church on a Sunday and everyone looks like you and everyone sounds like you and everyone's kids, remind you of your kids, I don't know. That sounds to me more like a clique than it does a church, because churches at their core are meant to reach out and include everybody.
They are. I mean, and then I'll just be contrarian for a second, because I don't think we can diminish the importance of community
Correct.
to people. And so particularly right now, with the way social media has fractured us, with the way COVID didn't help this, but the way we've been isolated from one another, for a lot of people, that church, which may look very much like the church that I went to in 1960s, it gives them something. It gives people something. And Jane and I will go to church a number of times a year, and it is because of the familiarity. It is because of the music, and it is that sense of, okay, there's a rooted belonging here that comforts me. I'm not saying that is, a deep faith journey, and I think that I have lots of questions about that too, but I don't think we can diminish that or just negate it, So it's very complicated. The other aspect of this that for me is interesting as a politician, I had a colleague, John Malloy, who now teaches at Laurier.
Yeah.
And we had many, many conversations about faith and politics and how we do or do not in this country talk about how our faith informs our politics. And
very different than south of the border, right?
Very different than south of the border.
Yeah, very different.
And what I'm talking about is, whether I go to church or not, my sense of right and wrong, my sense of morality, my sense of why I'm on the planet in terms of trying to find ways to give back, that is rooted in the church. My grandmother was she was a believer. She worked in the United Church her whole life. And it was part of the moral code of our family that we needed to find a path that was true and that was right and that would serve others. And so, for sure, that has informed my my desire to be involved in good policy making that would help people. So I think that's another aspect of what's the point of bringing kids into a religion at all, into some kind of faith group. Well, it is a way of establishing conversations about, well, what do you believe in? How are you going to live your life? What's your life going to mean or look like? And for me, that's informed how I did politics.
I hear that tie between the religion and politics piece, and you're right that it is very different in Canada, and you can be informed by it, but can you speak loudly about it and still maintain a platform? And it's difficult, right? Like, it's difficult to live in both those worlds, even if you're a religious leader. I found in my last couple of years of ordained ministry that because of the way I had been formed, because of what I believed, because of concepts like grace and mercy that I talked about in my book. When you get what you don't deserve, and when you do
Deserve what you
yeah,
don't get.
yeah, something like that. But when you function in these ways that say that everyone's welcome at the table, even the ones you don't like, even the ones who've done you wrong, even the ones who everyone says should be shackled on the outside of town, right? And I started to take, I would say, political positions at times. You know, there were very significant events in Toronto, like the Toronto van attack, right? Where we had to respond to that as religious leaders when everyone wanted to condemn.
Yeah.
And there were reasons to condemn. But we have to remember that's a human being that something happened to that caused him to act that way. And the kinds of folks that I work with today, I have my executive clients who I'll keep separate from this because I don't mean them when I say this. But a lot of the folks I've worked with in rapid access addiction medicine, in crisis, and now in case management are folks that often, if they were to show up on a Sunday or Saturday or wherever it might be, or whatever religious affiliation you belong to, they would often be made to feel unwelcome. If they were to be honest about their history or their circumstance or their criminal record or their addictions, it's not just unwelcome, they might even be actively encouraged to marginalize themselves.
Yeah.
I think that's where non-religious community organizations step in, right? Like I think that I would love to see religious organizations do better at this, and some do. Some do great jobs. Let's not be honest. But I don't think they're the norm. I think that they're the ones that get noticed and get articles written about them because those groups. There's an Anglican church on Sherbourne Street. I think it's All Saints that has done incredible work with the marginalized people for my entire life. But that's not the norm, really, and that's why money has to go towards that kind of thing. But I'm starting to see a rise in kind of startup community groups of people who will create affiliation to one another, both online and in person, and it almost feels like church. It has that kind of feeling, although it's just filled with misfits.
Yeah. Well, isn't that how churches started? It wasn't
Truly.
the status quo. It wasn't people who were part of the elite who established early church. So I think, if the institution broke down completely, we would recreate it as human beings in some way, because we want to belong. We want to be part of something. And fundamentally, we want to help each other, but we get really misguided. Yeah. And I was just, when you were talking about your work now, I just read a book called Indictment by Benjamin Perrin. And it is an indictment of the criminal justice system. And he tells a lot of stories of clients and people who have been involved with criminal justice. But at the root of it for me was this conversation about what kind of justice system we want. We talk about restoration, restorative justice, but we really have a system that is retributive and that does not really try to rehabilitate people.
100%.
We throw people away, and to our detriment. Yeah. Not just to the detriment of course, to the detriment of those human beings, but to the detriment of our society. And that we do not understand trauma, and we do not understand how early trauma leads to all the kinds of things that you were talking about. And for the most part, the people who are in our prison system. So I think that those principles that we're talking about of caring for one another and, trying to create a community where everybody belongs, if we don't get a handle on our belief around who's good and who's bad, as opposed to damage. And I had this debate as a politician. For example, a policy like the basic income pilot, right? Yep. So basic income is, to me, an extension of creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to live a decent life. And the reason we did a pilot was that our social assistance program really does not do that, and I wanted to try something different. But one of the really big hurdles on basic income is this narrative around, well, why would we give people money for doing nothing, as opposed to if someone's working a job and they can't put food on the table, or if they are not able to work in the system that we've set up that has such rigid parameters around what you have to wear, how many hours you're at work, all those things that for some people are just impossible. But we would rather have that person living on the street than actually have enough money to be able to live. It makes no sense.
It makes zero sense.
Makes no sense.
And I find, I'm so happy to hear you say that. I have to be honest, because I have this conversation with people all the time that for some folks, it's going to be 6 months before they're ready. For some folks, it's going to be 2 years before they're ready to step back in. For some folks, it's going to be 10. And for some folks, they're never going to be ready.
Exactly.
And so we can either say, because you're as damaged as you are, regardless of how you got there, and I'm damaged too, so I'm not. It's not like it's not a judgment, but as damaged as you are, our society is going to say you're screwed.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's. I think it lacks wisdom. It lacks forethought. And the truth is, I hear lots of some of my corporate clients, like to. Law and order, law and order, law and order, and I appreciate that's necessary on some level, but the way to create more crime is to disenfranchise more people.
Right. So when we talk about reconciliation in this country, and we look at the majority of people who are in our prison system, they're Indigenous people and Black people. That's who's there, and so. How can we, in good faith, talk about reconciling and the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people and ignore the fact that the trauma that has been undergone, intergenerational trauma of these kids, and they're young people. And I can just hear the people the law and order folks who are saying, well, yeah, but if somebody kills somebody, they go, okay, fine. We have to deal with those things. I understand that. But the vast majority of people who are in the criminal justice system get in young, and it gets worse for them because they are sucked into the system. Totally. So we do nothing at the early stages, not to mention how we don't do the things that are needed early on, like make sure they're moms, because it's usually single moms. Yeah. If we're talking about, the population who struggles, there are so many single parents who do not have what they need. And so that's why policies like basic income, actually, they are directly related to the outcomes for those kids later in their life. Anyway, yeah. I'm not at that table anymore, so I don't get to make those decisions.
But I'm glad you still get to talk about it because you have such a great amount of experience and wisdom to bring to the table. 20 years as a member of provincial parliament, I believe. And
19. I was in elected office for 22 because I was a school trustee before that.
School trustee before that. I'm a single dad myself, and my ex-wife and I work very hard to support each other in raising our son Rory. But it is hard to make ends meet in this city. Mm-hmm. It is. It's like with the skyrocketing rental prices, with groceries through the roof, with the standard of living that exists in Toronto. And I do okay for myself, and even for someone like me, it's a struggle. Yeah. So I can't imagine, trying to make it by on a $35,000 or a $40,000 salary. Yeah. There's not an apartment in the city you can afford on that kind of salary. So if you're functioning on your own, trying to raise a kid, it's, you're probably working 2 or 3 jobs. Things happen, and people make kids, teenagers, young adults make mistakes. But at the same time, I've had clients who have spent years in the correctional facilities all over, from prison to jail. And the hard truth is, if we don't find a way to rehabilitate, and not just rehabilitate, but help people find peace some kind of peace, all the attachments and relationships that they're connected to are going to get worse. Right? So we're taking somebody who we think we're going to separate from society so that so people can be safe, they can be safe, so there can be some rehabilitation. But if the only thing left on the other side is broken relationships, broken life, and broken values, I'm not sure how anything's going to get better. I think what ends up happening is more dominoes and more perpetuating of a system that only elevates those who've had opportunity and pushes down those who don't.
It just increases that gap.
It does.
And that, that may feel good to people who want to see people punished, but it doesn't serve them in the long run. It's like when I would knock on doors, and I've knocked on thousands of doors, but I would, every now and then I'd knock on a door and someone would say, someone who's older would be talking about taxes, and they'd be talking about the education system. And why should they pay taxes into an education system when they didn't have kids, they never had kids, and they didn't have anything to do with the education system? What did it have to do with them? And it would always take me aback because, and I would say to them, I don't think you want to live in a society that doesn't have a good publicly funded education system. I don't think you want to live in a neighborhood that doesn't have a good school, because you want those kids to have opportunity because that's going to serve you, But we get very focused on our own needs. And I think it's hard sometimes for people to think about that interconnectedness, which actually takes us back to the organized religion, because one of the things that I really do value about organized religion is that it brings generations together, so that older people, younger people, there aren't that many places right now where in our society where people of different ages hang out together,
Right.
But in places of worship, that often does happen. And so that in itself is a good thing.
And I think that's what I was trying to get to around the diversity of groups and communities we belong to. Because if you don't know anyone who's ever committed a crime, or if you don't know anyone who has a family member who's ever been addicted to a substance, or you don't
know a gay person, or you don't know a lesbian,
why would you care?
Yeah.
Do you know
exactly.
what I mean? And I think that exposure to people of all walks of life builds empathy, right? Because if empathy is really feeling and seeing and hearing other people's feelings and having them resonate with you, that's only going to happen with experience. It's only going to happen by spending that kind of time. And I think that I look at my son, and when he goes to church with his mom at one place, he goes with me to another place. I spend more time when I go to church, going to Catholic churches these days for a whole bunch of reasons. But so he has different experiences of church. And one of his comments, and this will be his review of wherever he was, he'd be like, well, that wasn't much like Jesus. And
good for him.
Yeah, I always laugh at him because, to really be like Jesus, it would... there'd be probably some tables being overturned, and there'd be a whole bunch of things happening. But I get what he's saying. Because he's had a good, authentic experience of what God's love is like. And I talk in my book about the different kinds of love that there are, and that agape is the love language of Jesus. It's God love, right?
Yeah.
It's love that's meant to take everything you've got, your last cent, your last breath, give it to someone else and ask for nothing, right? And I think that if we took a little, it's Holy Week, we're heading to Easter. I'm a former priest. It's worth saying. If we looked at that guy Jesus and see what his life really looked like around advocating for women, widows and orphans, around always being on the side of the poor, breaking bread with criminals on a regular basis.
Women of ill repute.
Women of ill repute, right? Yeah. No, and I bet you he'd even hang out with a defrocked priest once in a while.
I bet you he would.
But no, I think that there's something to be said for that, about organizations in our culture that can speak prophetically to the wider community, right? And I think if we took more of that kind of bent, maybe the politics and religion intermingling could happen a little bit more easily. I think if all we're doing is talking about how, that kind of prosperity gospel that says, God's brought me health, wealth, and all the great things, and my beautiful wife, and my my nice car. No, I have no interest in hearing a politician talk about that at all. But if a politician were to talk to me about how they get on their knees 5 times a day to pray because it reminds them how small they are in comparison to the wider community and God. Or
they spend hours at a gurdwara making food for anybody who comes.
Right. Right.
Amazing. I had that experience in Brampton, but I had the experience in India of these massive congregations of people who just make food, and it doesn't matter who you are. You walk in and you're fed, you know? I think we have so much to learn from each other. Yeah. And it has less, for me, it has less to do with the rhetoric and more to do with the action and the human compassion, And that then can inform our political discourse, I think.
Absolutely. So you're not in office anymore.
No.
But I know after you finish here, you're heading up to the university. What are you doing over there?
So I teach a first year seminar in September, and I teach a fourth year seminar in public policy in the winter term. And I love it because, a couple of reasons. The main reason is it gives me a chance to hang out with young people for a couple of hours a week, which is so grounding and terrific. And it also gives me an opportunity to talk about public policy and really Ontario for the last 25 years, which is the public policy window that I was active in, and sort of pull back the curtain on how decisions were made and how I got involved, why I think it's worth it, because there's a lot of disillusionment about political activity right now, rightly so. It's seen as toxic, it's seen as, counterproductive, perpetuating a system that hasn't worked. And I get that. But what I try to do is just open up my experience to these young people and let them have at me. I mean, we have lots of conversations about whether capitalism is even workable or salvageable, That's their job. Their job is to question everything. And so to have somebody who's actually been in the trenches and can say, well, okay, this is how I thought about increasing the minimum wage. This is why I did it when I did it. This is how I thought about changing the sexual assault and violence laws on campuses, for example, So we have those conversations, and this is why we brought in free tuition, and this is what happened when we brought in free tuition, and then when it was canceled, these are the people who, by this government, these are the people who were disadvantaged. So we have those discussions.
Do the students make you hopeful for the future?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. They're so bright, and they're so enthusiastic about life, and that is really inspirational. I worry at how much pressure is on them. They many of them are working, some of them more than one job.
Yeah.
It's very hard.
Everybody works more than one job now.
Yeah, it's very hard for them to focus on their some of them to focus on their schoolwork, and even then, they're really anxious about the future. They don't know what's going to come. Many of them will just say, I'm never going to own a house. I'm never going to be able to live, and I try to kind of reposition that you don't know. You just don't know what life is going to bring to you. And part of what's important about this conversation that we have in the class is you can have an impact on that, Yeah. If young people engage in the political process, it changes. Yeah. And they don't, and that's a bad thing. So Yes, I love the teaching, and then I'm asked to come and speak different places. I speak in high schools to grade 10 students. I speak to groups of people, particularly around International Women's Day. It's very busy because people want to know what it's like to be a woman in leadership and to take all the stuff that's thrown at you.
Well, and this is what I was going to ask, and I'll ask it, but I'll do a little bit of qualifying as well. Whether you miss political life, miss sitting in Parliament, miss leading the party and leading the province, but it can't have been easy as the first of this, the first of that, right? Like, and as a woman in leadership, as an openly gay person, you have to have war wounds that most people can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's interesting, David. People ask me that question a lot. What was it like to be the first woman premier? Well, and my answer is always, well, I've never been a man premier, so I don't know. I don't know. Was it harder? I mean, I don't mean to be glib about it, but I've never walked into a room and been the tallest person. I don't know what it's like to walk and feel safe in an underground parking lot because that's my lived experience. So it was. Once I got into that role, I realized then how important it was to people. So I would have parents and grandparents come up to me and say, it's so important that you're there. I have my son's gay and my daughter's lesbian. And I had a woman, a young athlete during the Pan Am Games come up to me and say, I came out to my parents the day you were elected leader because she felt that it was safe to tell her parents she was a lesbian because the premier was a lesbian, So it wasn't that I knew all of that before I got into the role, but once I was there, I realized that it was really important to people. And there's no doubt that there was, there was a difference. I knew there was a difference. I mean, I would sit around tables of men and they would want to make eye contact with my chief of staff because he was a big burly guy. They couldn't believe I was the decision maker, So I knew that. But honestly, David, that had been my experience before I got into politics,
Sure. Yeah.
So
you didn't start being a woman when you got into politics.
Exactly. I mean, when I was first elected in 2003, we formed a women's caucus within our government. Dalton McGuinty was the premier, and it was a great caucus, but we formed a women's caucus, and because there was a women's caucus, we put poverty reduction on the agenda. We hadn't run on that. And so what I know is that having different voices at the table means you talk about different things, you make different decisions. And in our case, because I was a female premier and I had a deputy premier who was female, we invested in different things. We saw the world differently,
Yeah.
And that is why, to go to your point, that's why we need diversity at all of these tables.
I agree.
Because otherwise, we do not make decisions that I think include as opposed to exclude.
So I'll share one story and then I have a comment for you. When the weekend after you became the first female premier in Ontario's history, I was serving as a priest at the time.
In 2013.
Yeah. I was at a church, I think it was just outside of your constituency. And I had I don't know how to describe it other than the great pleasure and fortune of being a white, straight identifying man who connected really well with the LGBTQ community. And I was one of the first priests in my diocese to start doing same-sex weddings. And that first weekend after you became premier, I can't tell you the number of people who cried in my office. So happy. These young men and women who could not have imagined for most of their life, right? This idea that you could be the premier, it meant things to them that they couldn't even describe, and so it was just tears. It was beautiful.
It was very emotional when I was that first year in 2013 when I went to the Pride celebrations. It was overwhelmingly emotional, and my partner Jane, she had struggled with coming out when she was a young person. I came out when I was 37, so I had a different experience of that. I'd lived with white heterosexual privilege for a long time. But kids who didn't, it was, I felt that in the gay community right through my term. And I still feel it, it's still important because once something's been done, it can be done again. And that's
without a doubt, right?
Yeah.
And it was that era, we'll call it the Kathleen Wynne, Barack Obama era, where, things were, glass ceilings were being shattered in a whole bunch of ways. So I guess I didn't quite get the final answer. Do you miss it?
Yes, I do miss it. That, people say you must be glad to be out of it. No, I'm not glad. I'm not glad to be watching what's happening in our political realm right now. And so I'm particularly not happy to be out of it because I think there's a lot of damage being done right now. If I look at the provincial level, if we look south of the border, we look at what's potentially going to happen south of the border, what potentially could happen here if we have a change of government and I will say, and I'll be partisan right now, if Pierre Poilievre becomes the prime minister, I'm very, very worried about the institutions that we have built over decades, that we believe in, that have served so many people so well, that they will be damaged. And I think that in the same way that Doug Ford campaigned on slogans about, the little guy, and Pierre Poilievre talks about, I don't know if he talks about real people, but people who seem to be left behind. I'm not saying there aren't people who've been left behind. There absolutely are. But the solutions, if there are any that are coming from that side of the political spectrum, from the far right, they don't help. They're not going to help. So they will marginalize people more, cutting our institutions, cutting the funding to institutions that are designed to bring people in. They're not perfect, but if we don't nurture them, if we don't try to make them better, then we're in trouble. So I'm worried about what's going on, and so that makes it hard for me to stay out of the public realm, keep my mouth shut.
Do you think you will? Do you think that you'll
I won't run again. I won't run again. But I definitely have opinions, and when I'm asked, I will give my opinions.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I think I think it's a good thing that your voice is still in the mix, especially with the state of the way things are. And I can't say that I have always voted for your party. More often than not, if I were to be honest about it. But I do see more than just political consequences to the political directions that we're going in. In 2016, when Donald Trump was elected south of the border, I remember at the time, and I'll show my political stripes as well, I felt my stomach just like for days just falling out of my body. I couldn't believe this was real. Yeah. And I watched slowly and quickly at times as rhetoric changed, even in my own community and circles, where things that were not acceptable prior to say or do, all of a sudden were normal.
So new permission. I've been talking about this a lot in the last few weeks. A permission for misogyny, for racism, for homophobia, that we thought we had, we collectively, we thought we had. Not that we'd suppressed it, but we'd changed the norm, as you say. Yeah. And that's changed back, Yeah. And so I think we have to worry about that, because if we accept that civility is just gone, that we're just not even going to try, then I don't know how we carry on as a community, because things get harsher and harsher, more violent in terms of language and physical violence. Yeah. And I think we're on the wrong path, Yeah. And so it's worrisome for me in terms of the political realm, but it's worrisome in terms of the direction of our society. Yeah. And I don't think it's a trivial concern.
And I do think this is where we as Canadians now have something to offer. I think that we have begun, and I'll say begun, it's more so in some places, but we've begun a process of truth and reconciliation, right? Kind of as a DNA changer in our society. And I did a lot of study on truth and reconciliation before it became kind of Canada's norm. being formed in the Anglican Church, I did lots of study on South Africa and apartheid and the role of Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, and studied under a priest at one point who spent lots of time going back and forth to the Diocese of Umtata, which is a rural diocese in South Africa, and hearing stories when Bishop Sitembeli would come and visit about criminals who had done just atrocious things. But when they had to speak out loud in front of victims, what they'd done, they were changed.
Right.
That it's when we are put in a bubble that, I'm trying to remember, like an echo chamber, right? Where Donald Trump lives in the most, it's not even big, it's a tiny little echo chamber filled with anyone who will say anything that he likes.
Yeah.
And so he can say atrocious things about anyone he wants, atrocious things about women, about minorities.
And lies about how the world works and about his own actions. It's frightening.
I think the truth is, if you were to dig down into that psyche, you'd find a pretty broken person who really just needs a mom to love him, right? Like, I don't mean to say it that way, but the more I read and hear stories of truth and reconciliation about people who've done terrible things, who really do wrestle with it, and then have to wrestle with it in front of those they may have hurt or those like the people they've hurt, there's actual possibility for movement and change.
Well, that's exactly to go back to that book that I talked about, Indictment.
Yeah.
That's exactly the vision for a restorative process that he holds out, and it is related to our national attempt at reconciliation, but it is also on that individual level. And years ago, when I was a community mediator, we looked at models like community conferencing that I think is from New Zealand or Australia, where people are obligated to do exactly that, surrounded by the people who they've affected, the community that has been hurt by what they did, and in talking about what they did, that changes, and the community takes on a different responsibility for the path of that person going forward. We don't do that well in our Western system in Canada, and I think
we don't forgive well.
We don't forgive. We
don't.
don't.
We much prefer
to punish,
isolate, cut off.
Yeah.
It's kind of the root of cancel culture as well, right? Is that we want to say, I don't want to see you anymore.
Yeah.
Then I don't actually have to forgive you. If I don't see you, I don't hear you.
Yeah.
You're just other.
Yeah.
And I actually think that could be the thing that really makes any attempt at truth and reconciliation fail. Because if, I said to a colleague recently, a former colleague, priest, I'm like, if you can't forgive the likes of me, how do you expect the indigenous community to forgive the likes of you, right? Like, we've all got to come to the table with what we've done wrong, and be able to look at each other, and instead of building walls, build bridges, right? Like, there's no other way to a community life than to put bridges up instead of walls.
Right. And we have to be able to do that and carry on at the same time. It's not like everything stops.
No.
We have to find a way to, it's a process. Truth and reconciliation, whether we're talking about it in terms of individuals or whether we're talking about it in terms of a society, it is an ongoing process. It's not an event that happens and then it's done. Yeah. And so it's interesting. There's a big conversation now about land acknowledgements, and whether they should or we shouldn't do them. They're performative and all of that. And early on in my political career, I started doing land acknowledgements, particularly when I was Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, but then when I was Premier as well, and Minister of Education, because at that time, so this is starting as early as 2006, at that time, nobody was doing land acknowledgements very much, and I did them to make people uncomfortable, and I did.
I like that about you.
Well, because it felt like, okay, this is something that is going to mean you're going to have to think about this. Anyway, And I get that now, everybody does them, and that's fine. But I think, our work's not done there, So yes, maybe land acknowledgements have become performative, but do we understand that the land that we're on was not land that was ours, And I'm talking from a settler perspective. So let's not just say, well, we've done that, and now we can move on to the next thing. We have to internalize some of these things. We have to understand what has happened to people. And when people say to me, well, I don't understand intergenerational, what are you talking about? So stop and figure it out.
Read
something about it, because
lots out there.
Because the trauma that's handed down from one generation to the next, from a family to their children, to their grandchildren, yes, it is hard to understand, but it is important. And if we don't get it, then what you're talking about in terms of really forgiving ourselves and forgiving each other, it's hard to make that happen.
I totally agree. And I think that we are seeing a difference. And I see the big, we talked earlier about the education of children and how much that matters, investing in that. I look at my almost 11-year-old and the kinds of education that he's had on truth and reconciliation, the kind of education he's had on history of Canadian people, the kind of education he's had on sex ed, which I will give you lots and lots of credit for. If I had had any of those things, never mind all three, the more complete, more vulnerable, more empathetic person I would be, and someone who would not make as many mistakes, right? Like and he sees these things as normal, right? Like he does. This is the life that he has, right? Because this is how he's been educated.
So when you ask me if I miss politics, yeah, I do, because my hand is in all of those things.
Yes, it is.
We changed the curriculum in the province. We made certain things mandatory in terms of the rewriting of our history and our relationship, the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And so it makes me deeply happy when I hear kids talk about those things in a way that means that they understand that we didn't do it right, that Canadian history did have a lot of injustice in it. And when I hear kids talk about in Ontario, trans, oh yeah, we know about that. We talked about that in school. That's a really good thing. So when we go back to this conversation about the new permission to move backwards, what's going on in Alberta, what's going on in Saskatchewan, this weaponizing of parents' rights, that somehow a parent's right is to withhold information from their children or to marginalize their child. That's wrong-headed, and we have to push back against it, because it doesn't prepare kids. If they don't have information, it doesn't prepare them for the world that we want them to live in.
Totally. It doesn't prepare them for the world I lived in. Never mind the world that exists now, because it's real.
Exactly.
You can't walk back from it.
Yeah.
So we're listening to the Blue-Eyed Devil podcast on Spotify, Amazon, Apple, and 403LC. And usually I do rapid fire as we get close, but I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to ask some questions that I'm curious of the answers. I really am. And I'm going to start with one. I hope you'll answer it. Who's your favorite conservative politician?
I really like Jean Charest. I think he was part of when I was in Dalton's cabinet. Charest was in Quebec, and it was a good relationship. I think he's a really interesting guy, and really understands the country in a way that a lot of us don't.
What is your biggest regret in office?
Oh, I have lots of political regrets. I wish we'd done a lot of things sooner. I wish I'd gotten the basic income in place sooner. I wish we'd gotten it finished so we'd have the evidence. I mean, that's a big one for me. I think that's probably the biggest one, because if we had had the time to transform the social assistance program, I think it would have made such a huge difference to our society, you know? So that's a big one. But there are all sorts of other things that I was impatient to get done.
Who's your hero?
My hero, you know, I really love looking back at people like Agnes MacPhail, Nellie McClung, who were feisty, strong women. And I would often look at their language and laugh and just take heart from them pushing back against the nonsense of sexism 150 years ago. So they gave me strength. And then the modern day versions of them, you know, people like Nancy Ruth, people like my mentor, Sheila Ward, who was her own broken, sweet person, but she encouraged me and helped me. So strong women.
Very good. Thank you for answering those. So
You're welcome.
they're just little ones, but I will share a quick story before we finish up. And you know, I've gone through my own trials and tribulations in life. You know, I've talked on different episodes of bouts in my life. After a fractured ankle, I struggled with addiction to oxycodone. My marriage failed. My career went here, there, and all over the place. And, you know, I wrote a book that got a little bit of attention, sold some copies, opened up a new life for me. But I will never, ever forget a morning. It was a July morning. I opened my email, and there was an email from you telling me you'd just read my book, how much it meant to you, and that you'd love to sit down and talk with me about it. And I was sitting with a couple of friends at the time, and I was actually in between work at the time, and I wasn't really sure where I was going or what was going to happen next. And I couldn't have been more overwhelmed with I want to say pride, but it wasn't pride. It's the wrong word. I was just overwhelmed by your kindness because you didn't have to do that, and it really meant such a huge thing to me.
Well, I remember having read the book, and I kind of knew where you were at. I was worried about you.
Yeah.
You know, I was worried that I loved the book, and it was so honest. It was raw, but it was honest. And I just wanted you to be okay. And you are so okay.
Some days.
You've so landed on your feet, and I can say proud. I mean, I feel proud of the journey that you've taken and that you've landed where you are. And, you know, your son is very lucky to have you as his dad. I don't know his mom, but I'm sure he's lucky to have both of you.
He is.
Yeah.
And I think I will probably wrap us up there because I don't know if I can keep moving after feeling emotional like that. But thank you. And Kathleen, this has been such a pleasure to sit down with you.
It's been great fun. Thank you.
And I know there are lots of people looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And we'll launch it before Easter Sunday this week. And thank you. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you. And you know, I hope that you continue to walk this path and help people understand what you've been through, because that will help them. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. This has been the Blue Eyed Devil podcast on Spotify, Amazon, Apple, and 403LC. Be well, and we will see you on the journey.
The Blue Eyed Devil.